Dr. Marcus Holloway adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he surveyed the packed auditorium. Philosophy 301 was always well attended, but today's lecture on Schopenhauer's views on women had drawn an unusually large crowd. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a middle-aged professor who'd spent decades studying the great philosophers, yet remained perpetually bewildered by the women in his own life. Schopenhauer believed that women were fundamentally different creatures. Marcus began, his voice carrying across the silent hall. He argued that they were driven by will rather than reason, by emotion rather than logic. A hand shot up from the third row. Sarah Chen, one of his brightest graduate students, leaned forward with that familiar intensity that both impressed and unnerved him. Professor Holloway, don't you think Schopenhauer's views were shaped more by his personal failures with women than by any philosophical insight? Marcus paused, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on him. In that moment, he thought of his ex-wife Catherine, who'd left him 2 years ago with words that still echoed. "You understand every philosopher who ever lived, Marcus, but you don't understand the first thing about actual people." "That's an interesting perspective, Miss Chen. Perhaps we should examine what exactly Schopenhauer got right and what he might have missed." As the class erupted in discussion, Marcus found himself wondering if his students might teach him something he'd never learned from all his books. 3 days after the lecture, Marcus sat across from his younger brother David at their usual downtown cafe. David, a successful architect with an easy smile and natural charm, had always been the one who got women, or so Marcus thought. "You know what your problem is?" David said, stirring sugar into his espresso. "You treat women like they're puzzles to be solved instead of people to be understood." Marcus bristled. "I don't treat anyone like a puzzle." "Really? Tell me about Sarah, your graduate student. What about her? The way you describe her, intense, challenging, always asking difficult questions. You sound like you're analyzing a specimen rather than appreciating a brilliant mind who happens to challenge you." Marcus stared into his coffee, seeing his reflection waver in the dark surface. Catherine used to say something similar. Catherine was right. Look, I used to think I understood women too. Then I met Elena. David's face softened at the mention of his girlfriend. She taught me that understanding isn't about having theories or frameworks. It's about listening, really listening, without trying to categorize or explain. Schopenhauer would say you're being governed by your will, not your reason. David laughed. Maybe Schopenhauer never met anyone worth being governed by. As they walked out into the crisp autumn air, Marcus found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the relationship between philosophy and life. The university library was nearly empty at 9 p.m. when Marcus finally looked up from his research. He'd been diving deep into Schopenhauer's personal correspondence, searching for clues about the philosopher's relationships with women. What he found wasn't what he expected. "Working late again, Professor?" He turned to find Sarah Chen approaching with a stack of books under her arm. She looked different outside the classroom, less formal, more approachable. "Miss Chen, I could ask you the same thing." "Research never sleeps." She set her books down on the adjacent table. "Mind if I join you? These tables are better for spreading out sources." Marcus nodded, suddenly aware of how isolated he'd become in his academic bubble. As Sarah arranged her materials, he caught glimpses of her work: feminist philosophy, contemporary psychological research, critiques of traditional gender theory. "What are you working on?" he asked. "My thesis. I'm examining how 19th century philosophers' personal traumas influenced their theoretical frameworks, particularly regarding women." She glanced at his notes. "Looks like we're researching similar territory." "You think personal trauma shaped Schopenhauer's philosophy?" Sarah pulled out a worn journal. "His mother was emotionally distant. His relationship with women throughout his life was complicated at best. But here's what's interesting. His sister Adele had a completely different take on women's nature. She was intelligent, independent, and managed their family's financial affairs better than Arthur ever could. Marcus leaned back in his chair. So you're suggesting his philosophy says more about his personal limitations than universal truths? I'm suggesting, Sarah said carefully, that maybe we've been asking the wrong questions. The discovery happened by accident. While researching Schopenhauer's correspondence, Sarah found a collection of letters between Arthur and his sister, Adele, that had been largely overlooked by scholars. She brought them to Marcus's office the next morning, her excitement barely contained. "Professor, you need to see this." She spread the photocopied letters across his desk. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, clearly Adele's. As Marcus read, a different picture of the Schopenhauer family emerged. "Dear Arthur, you write to me about the nature of women as if you're describing creatures from another planet. Have you forgotten that I am a woman, that our conversations have always been among the most stimulating of your life? Your theories would benefit from less speculation and more observation of the actual women around you." Marcus looked up at Sarah. "This changes everything we think we know about his development of these ideas." "It gets better." Sarah pulled out another letter. "Look at this one, written just months before he published his essay on women. Arthur, your latest philosophical treatise arrived yesterday. I must say, your understanding of women's intellectual limitations is quite amusing, considering I've been managing our family's investments for the past 3 years while you focus on your books. Perhaps the limitation lies not in women's capacity for reason, but in men's capacity to recognize it when it doesn't mirror their own." Marcus sat back, stunned. She was directly challenging his core assumptions, and he clearly wasn't listening. The published essay shows no evidence of incorporating her perspective. Sarah's voice carried a mix of frustration and fascination. It makes you wonder what other voices have been dismissed or ignored throughout philosophical history. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like a student again, humbled by the realization of how much he didn't know. Dr. Elena Vasquez had agreed to guest lecture in Marcus's philosophy class, and her presence transformed the usual dynamic. As a cognitive psychologist specializing in gender differences, she brought a scientific perspective that challenged many of the students' assumptions, including Marcus's. Modern neuroscience shows us that the differences between male and female brains are far more subtle and complex than 19th century philosophers imagined, Eleanor explained to the rapt audience. What Schopenhauer attributed to fundamental nature, we now understand as largely cultural conditioning. A student raised her hand. "But surely there are some inherent differences." "Of course, but the key is distinguishing between biological tendencies and social construction. For centuries, women's exclusion from education and public discourse was justified by claiming they were naturally less rational. Yet when given equal opportunities, these supposed limitations mysteriously disappeared." Marcus found himself thinking of his ex-wife Catherine, who'd run a successful consulting firm while he struggled to balance his checkbook. Of Sarah, whose analytical mind often surpassed his own. Of Adele Schopenhauer, whose business acumen had supported her brother's philosophical pursuits. After class, Elena approached him. "You look like someone whose worldview just shifted. I'm beginning to think I've spent my career teaching ideas I never really examined." Elena smiled. "That's not a failure, Marcus. That's growth. The question is, what are you going to do with this new understanding?" As students filed out around them, Marcus realized he was about to find out. That evening, Marcus did something he hadn't done in months. He called Catherine. Her voice was cautious but not unfriendly when she answered. "Marcus, is everything okay?" I've been thinking about what you said when you left, about me not understanding people. A long pause. That's unexpected. What brought this on? Marcus found himself telling her about the letters, about Sarah's research, about Elena's lecture. Catherine listened without interrupting, a quality he'd forgotten she possessed. "You know what's funny?" Catherine said finally. "You're describing the same pattern that ended our marriage. You were so focused on understanding me theoretically that you stopped actually listening to me. I thought I was listening. You were analyzing. There's a difference. When I told you I felt intellectually stifled, you recommended books. When I said I needed more emotional connection, you explained the philosophy of emotions. You treated our relationship like a seminar." Marcus felt the truth of her words, like a physical weight. "I didn't know how else to love you." "I know. And that's not entirely your fault. You were taught that understanding meant having explanations for everything. But Marcus, some things aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be experienced." After they hung up, Marcus sat in his study surrounded by decades of philosophical texts, wondering if he'd been living his entire life at arm's length from the very experiences that might have given his learning meaning. The next week, Sarah asked if she could present her research findings to the class. Marcus agreed, curious to see how his students would respond to her challenge of one of philosophy's canonical figures. Sarah's presentation was methodical but passionate. She walked through Schopenhauer's personal history, his relationships with women, and the stark contrast between his theories and the evidence of women's capabilities in his own life. "The question isn't whether Schopenhauer was a misogynist," Sarah concluded. "The question is why we've spent so much time analyzing his ideas about women without examining the women who were actually in his life and what their perspectives might have contributed to philosophical discourse." A male student in the back row raised his hand. "But aren't you just applying modern feminist theory to historical figures? Maybe we should judge them by the standards of their time." Sarah's response was swift but measured. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that perpetuates these blind spots. Adele Schopenhauer wasn't applying modern feminist theory when she critiqued her brother's ideas. She was applying her own lived experience and intelligence. The standards of their time were often just the standards of a small group of privileged men." Marcus watched the exchange with growing admiration. Sarah wasn't just critiquing Schopenhauer. She was modeling a different way of engaging with ideas, one that valued lived experience alongside theoretical framework. After class, he approached her. "That was illuminating. I hope it wasn't too presumptuous, challenging one of your lecture topics so directly." "Sarah, I think you just taught me more about philosophy than I've learned in years. The question is, where do we go from here?" Marcus's proposal was unprecedented in his academic career. A co-authored paper with a graduate student examining how personal bias had shaped philosophical discourse on gender. Sarah was initially hesitant. "Professor Holloway, I appreciate the offer, but won't this look like academic nepotism?" "Probably. But I think the work is more important than the optics. Besides," Marcus smiled ruefully, "I'm finally learning that my reputation matters less than my integrity." They began meeting weekly, and Marcus found himself in the unfamiliar position of learning as much as he taught. Sarah's research methods were more inclusive, her analysis more nuanced. She helped him see how his own unconscious biases had colored his interpretation of texts he'd read dozens of times. "Look at this passage from Schopenhauer," Sarah said during one of their sessions, pointing to a heavily annotated page. "You've always taught this as his observation about women's nature, but read it again, knowing what we know about his relationship with his mother." Marcus reread the familiar words with new eyes. What he'd always seen as philosophical insight now looked like unprocessed personal pain. "He's not describing women," Marcus realized. He's describing his mother, and we've been teaching his psychological issues as universal truth. The implications were staggering. How many other philosophical insights were really just individual trauma disguised as objective observation? Their research led them deeper into the archives, uncovering correspondence between major philosophers and the women in their lives. What they found challenged not just Schopenhauer's reputation, but the entire canon of Western philosophy's approach to gender. "Look at this," Sarah said, spreading documents across Marcus's office floor. Kant's sister, Regina, managed his household and influenced his daily routine for decades, but there's no acknowledgement of her intellectual contributions. Nietzsche's relationship with Lou Salome profoundly influenced his later work, but she's treated as a footnote. Marcus studied the patterns emerging in their research. It's not just that they misunderstood women. They systematically excluded women's voices from the philosophical conversation, then drew conclusions about human nature based on that exclusion. Exactly. And then we've spent centuries teaching those conclusions as if they were based on comprehensive observation rather than selective blindness. The weight of their discovery was overwhelming. They weren't just challenging individual philosophers, they were questioning the foundations of how philosophical knowledge had been constructed. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly, "I think we're uncovering something that goes far beyond academic criticism. We're looking at how knowledge itself has been shaped by who gets to speak and who gets listened to." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "The question is, are we ready for the responsibility that comes with this understanding?" When Marcus and Sarah submitted their paper to the Journal of Philosophical Studies, the response was swift and harsh. The anonymous reviewer's comments were scathing. "This paper represents the worst kind of contemporary academic fashion, applying present-day political concerns to historical figures who cannot defend themselves. The author's attempt to psychoanalyze Schopenhauer based on personal correspondence is methodologically unsound and philosophically naive." Marcus stared at the rejection letter, feeling a familiar urge to retreat into safer academic territory. But Sarah's reaction surprised him. "This is exactly what we should have expected," she said calmly. "We're not just challenging ideas. We're challenging the authority of people who've built careers on those ideas. Maybe the reviewer has a point about methodology." "Marcus," Sarah's voice was firm, 6 months ago you would have written a review just like that. The question is, do you trust what we've discovered, or are you going to let institutional pressure make you doubt your own research?" Marcus thought about Catherine, about Adele Schopenhauer, about all the voices that had been dismissed throughout history. Then he thought about his own tendency to retreat behind academic authority when challenged. "You're right, but how do we get this work the serious consideration it deserves?" Sarah smiled. "We do what women have always had to do. We find another way." Instead of traditional academic publication, Marcus and Sarah decided to present their research at the International Conference on Gender and Philosophy. The audience was different, more diverse, more willing to engage with challenging ideas. Marcus had never been so nervous before a presentation. As he looked out at the audience, he saw skeptical faces alongside interested ones, and realized this moment would define the rest of his academic career. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I want to start with a confession. For 20 years I've been teaching Arthur Schopenhauer's views on women as philosophical insight. Today I'm here to explain why I was wrong." The presentation went better than either of them had hoped. The questions were tough but fair, and several audience members approached them afterward with their own research that supported similar conclusions. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had attended their presentation, introduced them to Dr. Amira Hassan, a philosopher from Cairo who had been researching similar patterns in Islamic philosophical traditions. The exclusion of women's voices isn't unique to Western philosophy, Dr. Hassan explained over dinner, but neither is the presence of women's intellectual contributions if you know where to look for them. Marcus felt a growing sense of excitement. They weren't just challenging individual philosophers, they were part of a larger movement to recover lost voices and perspectives. "This feels like the beginning of something much bigger than we imagined," he told Sarah as they walked back to their hotel. "It is," she replied. "The question is, are you ready to help lead it?" 6 months later, Marcus stood before a new class, but his approach to teaching had fundamentally changed. Instead of lecturing about philosophical ideas as established truths, he presented them as perspectives shaped by their historical context and personal limitations. "Today, we're discussing Schopenhauer's views on women," he began. "But first, I want you to meet someone who knew him better than perhaps anyone else." He projected Adele Schopenhauer's photograph on the screen, along with excerpts from her letters. The class was immediately engaged, seeing the philosopher's ideas challenged by someone who had lived with their consequences. Sarah, now working on her doctoral dissertation, often co-taught the class. Their collaboration had evolved into something neither had expected, a genuine intellectual partnership that challenged both of them to think more clearly and deeply. After class, Marcus found a message from Catherine waiting for him. She'd read about his presentation at the conference in an academic newsletter. "I saw the article about your research. I'm proud of you for having the courage to question your own assumptions. Maybe you are learning to listen after all." Marcus smiled, realizing that understanding people, whether historical figures or the people in his own life, wasn't about having the right theoretical framework. It was about remaining curious, staying humble, and recognizing that the most important insights often came from the voices that had been ignored or dismissed. That evening, as he walked across campus, Marcus thought about Arthur Schopenhauer and what the philosopher might have discovered if he had truly listened to his sister Adele. He thought about all the conversations throughout history between men and women that had been dismissed as unimportant, and all the insights that had been lost as a result. But mostly, he thought about the future, about Sarah and her generation of scholars who were committed to recovering those lost voices and perspectives. For the first time in his academic career, Marcus felt like he was part of something larger than his own understanding, something that honored both rigorous thinking and lived experience. The truth Schopenhauer had missed, Marcus realized, wasn't about women's nature at all. It was about the human capacity for growth, for questioning our own assumptions, and for remaining open to perspectives that challenge our most cherished beliefs. That understanding, Marcus thought, was perhaps the most profound philosophical insight of all.